When setting up a busking file, there's a misconception out there that they have to be overly complicated, or that there has to be all this different stuff and all these crazy macros going on. And that's not the case. However, there is a kind of this inverse relationship between versatility and speed. So the main concept of busking and the core to it is when I hit this button, something needs to happen. And I think it's really important when we're talking about busking to remember that we're not always making art. We're putting something on stage, in rhythm, on beat. So I can make things more specific, but to do that adds an additional layer of complexity to things. So I think it's important to keep that trade-off in mind, that there is a little bit of a disconnect between versatility and speed. When setting up our show file, it's all about real estate management. I have a limited number of buttons and faders, and I have a limited amount of screen real estate. And I want to make sure that I'm using this as well as I can. When we start talking about laying out our faders, we're going to talk about why things go where they are and how I'm actually using certain aspects of the desk as visual demarcators so I can find them in the dark. I'm a big fan of laying as many things out as I can on tactile surfaces as opposed to screens, because if I'm here, I can feel with my fingers where I am and I can be watching the stage. If I'm running it entirely off my screen, my head is down, I'm not paying attention to what's going on. There are some things that you have to put on your screens, but I try to limit or make sense of what that stuff is depending on the content. There are two different types of busking we can do on a console. There is playback style busking, which is what we're going to be discussing today, and manual value busking. They both have their merits. Manual busking is utilizing the command line and our groups and palettes directly to apply a look on stage. So for example, I can grab group 5 and I can put them in red and I can point them at the stage or at the lead singer. And I'm doing all of that via the command line. And those are all values that are coming up as red in my live table. And then I'm building these temporary looks on stage that basically never get recorded because I'm moving on to the next look and I'm just piling these values on top of each other and they're just changing live on stage. And I'm using a fader like a manual timing master to change the timing of these parameters as they move. We are talking about playback data. I prefer using playback style busking, and it's what a lot of various programmers use on different desks as well. One of the nice things about playback busking is I have everything accessible via buttons and faders, and I can also manage the playback interaction a little bit. I can set priorities on different things. I can set my speeds in advance. I can have handles that control different speeds for just certain things, and it allows me to basically set myself up ahead of time. A downside of playback busking is you need to make sure that your tools are there before you start. If I'm going on this trip and I don't pack it in my bag, it's not going to be with me when I get there and I need it. So there is a little bit more forethought involved in setting up a playback busking system, because I do need to take into account a lot of different considerations. However, the nice thing about dealing with a playback system is I could always fall back and implement something manually if I need to. So you can work in one system or the other, or you can work in a combination of both. One more thing to remember about when laying out your desk before we dive into it is numbering schemas are incredibly important. I have the ones that I use. You can use whatever you want, but be consistent. That allows us, as our show file grows and grows and grows, it becomes really easy to make wide changes because we know where to find things. One example of numbering schema that I'm talking about is when I'm laying out all of my faders here. I'm using a combination of cue lists and submasters. And I don't want to have to keep track in my head of what cue lists have I recorded, what submasters have I recorded. So I have a system of numbering a submaster or a playback cue list by the fader that it's on. So for example, on fader 1, I have cue list 1. Okay? On fader 2/1, page 2, fader 1, is cue list 21. If there was a submaster on that page, it would be submaster 21. Right? So this way I know, cool, I'm putting something on fader page 4, fader 3, it's going to be sub or cue list 43. As I move these faders around, it keeps me from getting a bunch of please confirm dialogues and then trying to remember what I've overwritten and then going to a submaster list and looking at it. All that stuff wastes time. By having the numbering convention of that the list or the submaster corresponds to the fader, it's just a quick way for me to manage that. And that's just one of many different numbering schemas that I work with. But whatever they are, just make sure you're consistent about it.